My name is Barnabas Vajda, and this is going to be a video lecture on the EuroClio project of Visegrad 4 countries. The main theme of the lecture and the educational material is on the media and media propaganda prior to 1989. I split up the lecture into 9 different sections, and each section should last some 2 minutes. The media life in East Central Europe prior to 1989 should be considered in a very different environment as far as technology and technical equipments are concerned. Prior to 1989, there were no videos, there were no internet, there was no social networking, there were no films on private demand. So in technical terms, media and the propaganda took place in a very, very different environment. The most significant difference is that information could be spread much slower. Information could be controlled much easier, and information could be checked much more difficult. It was very, very difficult to check the validity of information. In whole Europe, not only in East Central Europe, but in Western Europe too. In East Central Europe, there were no free political parties, neither free political newspapers, radios, and broadcasting. What makes Eastern Europe very special is that for quite a long time, almost for 40 years, in East Central Europe, in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and in other countries, there were no free medias. Media was strictly controlled by one and single political party. And there were no rival political parties to challenge the monopoly of the communist media. And since there were no alternative sources of information, it was a closed and strictly controlled media environment. One may ask what kind of media life prior to 1989 existed in East Central Europe. And the answer is very simple. There were political newspapers, political dailies, state-owned political dailies. There were some radio broadcast stations in rather bad quality. There were also some TV channels, also owned by the state, not private ones, and they were in very limited number. So it should be taken into consideration that this media life and media propaganda we are dealing with took place in an analog world, rather different from the digital world we live in today. And in this analog world, getting information, checking information, or making alterations, falsification in information was in a totally different environment. You could check the validity of the information very hardly. You didn't have alternative sources of information. Originally, propaganda is a general term. Propaganda means any attempt to propagate a product, a service, or an idea. People can propagate political ideas, and it has to be told that without free possibility of propagating political ideas, there is no free political life. However, what makes East Central European media propaganda so special? Why was it different? Why was it, let's say, out of normal? The most important thing is that in these East Central European countries, media was completely and entirely controlled by one single political party. And that was its reality throughout the times commencing from the 1950s up until the end of these regimes in the late 1980s. In East Central Europe, media was controlled by one and single party, that was the Communist Party, which had a monopoly over the entire media, including newspapers, books, cultural events, films, and everything you can imagine in the framework of social life. This was strictly controlled social and media life that differed so much from Western Europe. In Western Europe, propaganda of different political ideas was free. In Western Europe, propaganda or spreading information on certain products was free. But in East Central Europe, the situation was pretty much different. In East Central Europe, free rivalry was out of question. There couldn't be rival political parties. They were simply banned. There couldn't be alternative economic processes and economic projects different from the central planning. Private entrepreneurs in many countries in East Central Europe were simply banned. It did not exist. Free political entities and alternative parties and also alternative cultural forms and ideas were all banned. It was not a free state to live freely in these countries. And the monopoly of the Communist Party was entirely and completely ensured by using state secret services. So it was not just a free decision of somebody not to take part, not to write freely, but it was forbidden and punished many times. What does the no alternative mean in this case? Why we say that there were no alternatives in East Central Europe? It is because that in practical terms, rival political parties were banned, dismantled, and many times their leaders were forced to leave for exile abroad. And there were no alternative newspapers, and there was no chance to controlling these ideas. So this is exactly what makes East Central Europe so special and the media life so cruel and unfree in those times. Now something about the examples, specific examples of media in East Central Europe. If you look at the central political newspapers all around East Central Europe, you would find that they were pretty much the same. They looked almost the same. And remember, it was a time of printed newspapers. There were no online editions. There were no internet platforms. It was just political broadsheets that people read without, once again, without alternatives. What kind of newspapers are we talking about? For instance, in Czechoslovakia, Rudé Právo in Prague, Pravda in Bratislava in Slovakia. In Poland, Tribuna Ludu. They were without rivals. No other political dailies could exist. In Hungary, Szabad Nép, later Népszabadság, again, one single political daily. Or in Bulgaria, Rabotnichesko Dielo. In all these countries, the monopoly of these newspapers was complete. You could tell from the headlines of these newspapers that it was issued by the local Communist Party. You could also read in the headlines the famous Marxist slogan, "Proletars of the world unite." They looked pretty much the same, and they contained almost the same. Many times the editorial boards in these countries were explicitly told, informed from Moscow what to publish, even how to publish in these newspapers. Behind this closed media life there was a closed political life. It has to be acknowledged that it goes hand in hand. There can be no free political life without free media, and vice versa. In these countries, in all East Central European countries, rival political parties like Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, smallholders or nationalist parties were all banned or dismantled, or their heads forced to live in exile or sometimes executed. And because there were no rival political parties by time, the need for alternative information simply ceased to exist. By time, people didn't even realize that they get one single information every single day. Since the political life was based in all East Central Europe on a system of one and single party, namely the Communist Party, media was subjugated to the needs of the local Communist Party. Newspapers and TVs and radios were all controlled, explicitly controlled, by members of the Communist Party, and they published what they were told to publish. It is quite clear what were the intentions of the local Communist parties if you look at the legal framework of the media in the 1960s. For instance, if you read the Czechoslovak media law in the 1960s, you would find ideas like, quote, the media will closely cooperate with the state authorities, or, quote, the task, the message of the media is to make mass work and educate of people's masses. Or sometimes, quote, neither publishing companies nor publishers and newspapers cannot be subject of private entrepreneurship, which in other words means that basically the idea was that the media serves the interest of the Communist Party or sometimes the state, but in many times and in most cases this was the same. The interest of the state was interest of the party. They were supposed, the media was supposed to serve the party. And this was pretty much the same in the 1950s and 60s. Maybe in the 1980s there were some alternative sources, but basically the system remained in this form under a strict control of one and single party throughout the old times. The strict and controlled character of the media life in East Central Europe meant that the Communist Party could spread, could propagate, could publish any news it wanted to without any check, without any control, and therefore they were free to deliberately and consciously manipulate political news. The media was supposed to serve the party, and in order to do that, it was more than the media itself. So the regulation was more than the media itself. The media mattered. The media was supposed to serve the loyalty or the impression of the loyalty, the political stability of these countries. And that was strictly kept. That was strictly told to editors of the newspapers that they have to publish positive messages in accordance with the state they were published in. We should bear in mind that certain type of media propaganda took place on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Media propaganda is not just an East Central European phenomenon. During the Cold War times, media propaganda was made on both sides within the frame of the so-called psychological warfare. This was the term which was used, psychological warfare, to influence the opposition, to influence the adversary, to undermine the will of the adversary. Psychological manipulations have been quite common throughout the times. Sometimes it is done in order to achieve some material benefit. Sometimes it is done with a social purpose, like in East Central Europe, where, for instance, undermining the church, the priests, was one of the main ideological components of the propaganda. To discredit the Roman Catholic Church, to undermine people's confidence in it, and so forth. From historical research, we know that both on East and West, psychological warfare or media campaigns took place regularly. These were constantly, deliberately, and consciously orchestrated media campaigns on both sides of the Iron Curtain. In other words, fake news were spread throughout the world, and this is a process which took place mostly during the Cold War times. There were some typical media propaganda features throughout the Cold War times. Namely, for instance, one of the most favorable media propaganda theme was mobilization. Mobilization of masses. One of the best examples of this kind of propaganda mobilization of masses of people is the May the First Day parades throughout all East Central Europe. Another typical propaganda feature was the accent on the peaceful character of the adversary, or on the contrary, the hostile character of the adversary. In other words, peace was a catchword. We are the good guys who want peace, and the adversary does not want it. And it is as simple as this. This is one of the longest, the oldest media propaganda catchword, who wants peace. Also, a favorite propaganda theme was undermining the credibility of the opponent, saying that the opponent doesn't want to negotiate with us. These and many other forms and topics in this psychological warfare were very, very common on both sides. So media propaganda in East Central Europe has to be understood within the context of this kind of psychological or media warfare. State-sponsored media outlets, in other words, propaganda outlets, were set up both in East and West. It is rather well known that the Soviet Union was spreading its propaganda messages back in the 1950s throughout the whole world, and it continued to do it up until the end of the 1980s. Also, the Soviet Union, in technical terms, jammed Western radios and TV stations as much as it could to prevent East Central European people to watch Western TVs and listen to Western radios. So technical jamming was quite common, and the Soviet Union spent a huge amount of money to do it. It is also a kind of a propaganda preventing people to listen freely to different sources of information. On the other hand, it is also well known that the United States also set up state-sponsored propaganda stations. Radio Free Europe, for instance, or Voice of America were broadcast stations that were targeting East Central European audiences with also kind of propaganda messages. Of course, there were differences in content, but yet both were biased, one-sided, and intentional informations that were spread in order to change the regime in the one side or to keep the regime on the other side. In East Central Europe, the Communist Party had a brutal and total control over the media life. In practical terms, this control was done by several methods. The first method to do was to withhold information, not to publish some information. Any political opposition to the party, any kind of disagreement, any kind of alternative voices, alternative opinions were withheld, not published. Simply, they didn't appear in newspapers or in the news. Social revolt, uprising, or explicit opposition to the party was the most dangerous thing what media propaganda could imagine. And this is the background to those horrible events that were almost totally covered up by state authorities in the media. I mean, for instance, the self-immolation of several people in East Central Europe. Self-immolation, which means that some people burned themselves to death in order to protest against the regime. Richard Siwiec in Poland, Sándor Bauer in Hungary, Jan Palach in Czechoslovakia. All three can be named as examples of self-immolation. They died in horrible circumstances, setting themselves in flames, and all of them explicitly stated that they want to die because they protest against media, against the censorship and the lack of freedom in their respective countries. Withholding information was typical for political news, but it was not only for political news. Interestingly enough, for instance, sportsmen, sports personalities who left their country without permission because they wanted to start a professional life, what they couldn't do in their respective countries. These sport personalities were also doomed to silence. No information was published at home on them whatsoever. This is the example of footballer Ferenc Puskás, for instance, or Czech tennis player Martina Navratilova. No news were published at home on them. So this was basically the first part of the media propaganda. Simply, news were not published. Another form of media propaganda was over-projecting positive news. Over-projecting means exaggerated the positive messages on certain things that were favorable for the communist regime. This is a fine example of panel tower housing in all East Central Europe. Concrete blocks of flats as a way and means of affordable living in these countries. These countries were proud of providing affordable housing for people. And the message was over-projected, over-stressed in the newspapers, in the films, in the magazines. And this is the background of Nowa Huta in Poland. So many photographs, so many films, propaganda films, so many pictures illustrating newspapers on Nowa Huta in Poland. or in Stalinváros in Hungary, the same, and also Petržalka in case of Slovakia. These were highly propagated, over-projecting these positive messages. And over-projected positive messages from East Central Europe was quite common as far as international relations were concerned. This is the case of Yuri Gagarin, the first man in the space, who was, and his bravery was well over-projected in East Central European press. So this was the second form of making propaganda, stressing, over-stressing, over-projecting some positive messages. Probably the most successful way of making propaganda is publishing negative news, making negative propaganda. Communist propaganda could spread, could propagate intentionally, deliberately wrong, untrue, false news. They could do it because they had no political rivals, and the media didn't have media rivals as well. So they could spread kind of a desinformatia. This is the term from the contemporary life, an original a Russian term. They could explicitly spread desinformatia, untrue news, which we would call today as fake news. This is pretty much the same. When somebody is intentionally spreading false, biased, untrue information. During the Cold War times, this was done intentionally and targeting certain social groups, certain political groups, especially as far as Western governments were concerned. There is one big difference, however, and this is the situation that today propaganda can be checked. Today, now we know that information can be checked. There are alternative sources of information, but that was not true back in the 1950s and 1960s. At that time, checking information was simply not possible or very, very difficult. Why? For instance, because even listening to Western broadcasts in some countries was punished legally. People were punished for listening to Western radios. Also, in the 1970s, technically, watching Western TVs were very, very difficult. That changed in the 1980s, when in some countries, some technical possibilities appeared that people could watch some selected Western, for instance, Western German TV stations. But basically, there was no way of controlling information, and desinformatia was widely spread. As far as negative media propaganda is concerned, we have a fine example of the Colorado potato beetle. Colorado potato beetle and its story became one of the finest examples of an orchestrated negative media campaign in East Central Europe. Potato beetle appeared in Europe sometimes in the 1920s, right after the First World War, when it was shipped into Western French harbors, and it started to spread to Central Europe. And Colorado, or potato beetle, got into Central Europe sometimes in the 1950s and 60s, right at the time when the East-West relations were tense and were rather bad at that time. So this poor little Colorado potato beetle became the symbol of the American bad will, of the American arrogance. See, the Americans sent us this little insect to destroy our crops. If you look at the posters that depict Colorado beetle and its spread into Central Europe, you would discover that in all East Central European countries, it was pretty much the same symbol, the same visual language that was used to spread the message that the Americans are bad people. The symbolism was used that the stripes over the hump of the Colorado beetle was similar to the suit of Uncle Sam as a symbol of the American rich life. So it was orchestrated, it was centralized, and the message was spread even if it was not true. But the message had to be spread for political reasons. As a historian, I have to tell you that discovering and dealing with propaganda issues in media is not an easy task to do. Maybe negative propaganda can be discovered and described quite easily. You find it, you understand it. But other means of media propaganda, and especially information that was not published or over-projected positive messages, are not easy to discover. You have to be very good at languages. You have to have an analytical skills to compare different sources, and it is sometimes very difficult to discover what was not published at the time. A fine example of withholding information, not publishing information, is the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's speech from February 1956. In February 1956, the Soviet Communist Party held its 20th annual Congress. It was a huge event, and it was extensively reported in East Central European press. Imagine long speeches of politicians, boring speeches were published word by word in their entire length. And yet, the key speech made by Nikita Khrushchev on 24th of February 1956 was not published at all. The example of the Pravda in Slovakia is a fine example. It published everything that was said during the 10-day long 20th Congress. And on 26th of February, which was Saturday, there was only a very short note on the front page of the newspaper saying, quote, on 25th of February, the 20th Congress continued with a session not open for the public. And that was it. The speech was not published, even not referred to as such, not at all. As now we know that Nikita Khrushchev's speech was published and was leaked to Western newspapers, Le Monde and Figaro and the Herald Tribune published it. The American government published it by the help of the CIA on 4th of June 1956. In technical terms, the media life in East Central Europe prior to 1989 took place in a very different technical environment, in an analog world, which was very different from the media life which we experience today. The access to information was much harder than today, and checking information was also very, very difficult, if not impossible. In the Visegrad countries, media life in the Cold War times was without political challengers. There were no rival political parties. There were no rival media outlets that could challenge the information that was spread in the communist media. The key term for describing media propaganda in East Central Europe is censorship. Simply, local communist parties didn't want to be challenged. Why? Simply because they didn't want to risk their political life. They wanted to keep the monopoly over the political and the media life. Media propaganda throughout the Cold War times, and especially in East Central Europe, had some typical themes, such as withholding information, not publishing them, sometimes spreading false, fake messages. And this is the international context of the psychological warfare that can be understood as an overall context of the Cold War media and propaganda warfare. And this analog world meant that information could be spread much slower than today. Sometimes they used another form of propaganda, which was the overprojection of positive news. But most often, communist media propaganda used negative propaganda, depicting the opponent in very negative way. Censorship, which means control over the media, was done on several levels and in different ways. On political level, censorship was applied through media and propaganda and agitation departments. They were called agitprop departments. There were people who controlled, in political terms, all newspapers, TVs and radios. In technical terms, propaganda and control was applied, and censorship was applied through technical editors, who were people directly in the press factory, making sure that only reliable news got out of the print. Censorship was applied through collective writing, which meant that all news were created collectively. So not one editor wrote the news, but there was a collective of workers, of editors, who sat down and wrote the news. Among them, there were so-called reliable editors who made sure that the final message of the news were favorable for the party. Finally, censorship was applied through a brutal control of state-owned secret services.